All right, welcome back, everyone. This is Der Waffner Waltz again. Going to be talking about sort of the final topic, final video for the series that I've created regarding firearm rights restoration, specifically to do with pardons. And so, if your conviction is of the type that cannot be reduced or otherwise handled in a way that restores your right to own or possess firearms, such as a 17B, Prop 64, or some other method, you're unfortunately not left with a whole lot of options. As I talked about in one of the earlier videos, there's always the option of potentially challenging the constitutionality of the restriction as applied in your circumstances. But again, that's usually a very tall order. And so in reality, the last sort of Hail Mary possibility to restore a person's right to own and possess firearms is a pardon. Now, of course, if your conviction was for a federal offense, meaning you actually went to federal court, federal criminal court, you were prosecuted by the United States Attorney's Office for a violation of federal law, your option for a pardon can only be obtained by the President of the United States, because generally speaking, only the President of the United States has the authority to issue pardons for federal offenses. If, on the other hand, your conviction was a state-level conviction, i.e. you were charged by a district attorney's office or even potentially a city attorney's office in rare circumstances, and your conviction causes a firearm prohibition, usually because it's a felony, or in the case of certain misdemeanor offenses, most notably, of course, misdemeanor crime of domestic violence, that is something that you can potentially obtain a pardon from the respective state's governor in which you were convicted. So obviously in California, that means under the current administration, obtaining a pardon from Governor Gavin Newsom. And obviously, most of you that are watching this channel or this video understand that Newsom is no friend to firearm rights, generally speaking. And so the reason why that is important to note and understand is that when you are requesting a pardon from the California governor, and you're doing so in the hopes of getting your right to own or possess firearms restored, you have to expressly state in the pardon application, or in the case of a certificate of rehabilitation, your certificate for rehabilitation packet petition, that you would like to have your rights restored. And so, right off the bat, that can, of course, cause a problem given the current administration's stance on firearms, generally speaking. I would be very surprised if Newsom would issue a pardon for the express purposes of restoring someone's right to own or possess firearms. Now, nevertheless, it does happen. He has granted pardons, of course, in the past, and the important thing is that that pardon be full and unconditional, and if it's a full and unconditional pardon, that's what will restore a person's right to own or possess firearms if their conviction was that which was prohibiting them from owning or possessing firearms. And so as long as you obtain a full and unconditional pardon, you should be go. So let's talk about specifically some issues that might come up, as well as some considerations. First and foremost, if you're trying to obtain a pardon here in California, there's generally two methods. The first method is to obtain first what's called a certificate of rehabilitation. The other method is to apply for what's called a direct pardon. where instead of getting a certificate of rehabilitation, you just apply directly to the governor's office for a pardon. Really, the difference between the two depends on where you currently live. If you are a California resident still, generally speaking, you should use the certificate of rehabilitation process. However, if you are a resident of a different state, but nonetheless you had your conviction from however many years ago and it occurred in California and you need to apply to the California governor's office, obviously, in that circumstance you would use the direct pardon application process. So as far as the certificate of rehabilitation is concerned, generally speaking, what you should understand is that you're basically petitioning a court to certify that you have been rehabilitated following your conviction. What you need to know, though, of course, is that if you obtain a certificate of rehabilitation, that in and of itself does nothing for a person's right to own and possess firearms. It does have some very limited effects and circumstances, like, for example, if you, on certain employment applications, things like that, you can show them that you've been certified by a court to be rehabilitated. That might weigh in your favor, of course, depending on the application. But generally speaking, it does nothing, like I said, for a person's right to own or possess firearms. However, if you were to obtain a certificate of rehabilitation from a court, at that point, that certificate of rehabilitation will automatically become an application for a pardon with the governor's office. And so, basically, either way, if you're submitting a petition for a certificate of rehabilitation, or if you're seeking a pardon direct from the governor's office, it still isn't of effect a pardon application one way or another. The difference being, like I said, is that you have to first apply for a court to certify that you've been rehabilitated before that will become a pardon application. The district attorney's office does have the option of opposing petitions for certificates of rehabilitation, and they will do it in some circumstances, but especially if in situations where the conviction is so old and, for example, you haven't had any other criminal issues since the conviction, that kind of thing. I would be surprised if a court doesn't issue one, generally speaking. But it can be a problem for some people, so it's not saying it's impossible that happens, but it can happen. So depending on your particular case and the facts and circumstances surrounding it, you may or may not have greater difficulty than others in getting a certificate of rehabilitation. Now, as I said, once you obtain a certificate of rehabilitation, your petition that you filed for that certificate of rehabilitation automatically becomes an application for a pardon with the governor's office. So regardless of what option you're using, whether it's a direct pardon or a certificate of rehabilitation, you want to, of course, give it your best shot either way. And so generally speaking, what I encourage individuals to do if they're going this route as sort of their last Hail Mary to try and get their firearm rights restored is in your application, you want to talk about absolutely everything that makes you potentially worthy in the eyes of a judge and ultimately the eyes of the governor to be granted a pardon. And so that can include, for example, community service, current employment, continued employment, what you've done, since being convicted to better yourself. And there's really no limit. So, I always encourage you to, think long and hard, tell your life story, why it is that you feel like you've been rehabilitated and are worthy of a pardon. to show the court and ultimately the governor's office, why that should be granted. Now, the other thing you need to understand, of course, is that let's assume, for example, that you've gotten your certificate of rehabilitation, or you're petitioning the governor's office directly for pardon. There is no time limit for the governor to act on your application. There is also no requirement that they notify you or update you on the status. The only thing that, for example, I would be able to do as an attorney is confirm that the application for a pardon has actually been received by the governor's office. Now, I haven't done a whole lot of pardons with Governor Newsom's administration for obvious reasons. Prior to Newsom, we had Governor Brown. He was a bit, he's still, he wasn't a friend to gun owners by any means, but I will say he was definitely more reasonable and balanced than Newsom in his approach to firearm laws, generally speaking. So we did have some success, although still very limited, in dealing with pardon applications with Governor Brown. But to date, I have not had any success, of course, with Newsom. So, again, if you're going this route, it's a Hail Mary. I think it's still worth it to pursue, but it is a unlikely scenario that you will actually be granted a pardon. The other issue that does come up occasionally is there is actually a limitation in California on when a pardon can restore a person's right to own and possess firearms, absent of the fact, even if the governor were to grant you a full and unconditional pardon. And that is in cases of where the conviction involved the use of a dangerous weapon. So what I mean by this is that if you were convicted of, let's say, a felony assault and battery or something, and that, for example, you involved the use of a firearm, the government code expressly limits pardons from restoring a person's right to own or possess firearms. So even if the governor were to grant it in those situations, it would have no effect on your right to own and possess firearms, and of course would not restore your rights in that situation. So that's one thing that we need to look at, of course, before you even go through this process. And of course, that generally entails looking at your rap sheet, as well as any information regarding the conviction, because sometimes, while it says, for example, you've been convicted of a certain offense, it might not specify some of the more finer details, like whether or not, for example, your conviction involved the use of a dangerous weapon. Now, the other consideration here is that as a matter of policy, generally speaking, the governor's office does not issue pardons for misdemeanor offenses. At least I've never seen it done for misdemeanor offenses. That's not to say it can't happen, but this is important, especially if your offense is being treated as a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence, which of course under federal law triggers a lifetime prohibition, but at least up until recently in California, if you were convicted of something that's considered a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence, that may not have a lifetime prohibition under state law, but obviously under federal law that's different. Now, California has, of course, changed that recently, so that if you have been convicted of a certain penal code offense, battery on a spouse, that type of thing, California law now does expressly prohibit a person from owning or possessing firearms for life as a result of that offense, even though it's a misdemeanor. So unless that somehow changes from a constitutional standpoint, that is another limitation on whether or not a person can actually seek a pardon for purposes of restoring the right to own and possess firearms. So with that said, if you are facing a potential conviction for something that could be construed as a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence, it's very important that you talk with your lawyer about the effects that would have, for example, on your rights in your future ability to own or possess firearms. Because, generally speaking, there isn't really any mechanism, at least under current laws, that will allow you to get your rights back. And so it's very important if, for example, you're in any sort of negotiations with the prosecutor's office, that you consider that possibility and that effect that it might have. So that's generally it as far as the topics I wanted to discuss about restoring your rights to own and possess firearms. Let this person pass here real quick. Lots of fast drivers on this road. So if you are interested in learning more, or you have questions about your own specific case, please feel free to give us a call. You can call the main office line at 562-216-4444. You can also send an email to helpdesk@michellawyers.com. That's HELPDESK at Michel Lawyers, MICHELLAWYERS.com. I will be making more videos, of course, on various aspects regarding California firearm laws. So be sure to subscribe and like the channel so you can stay up to date on the latest and greatest in California, including the highly anticipated decision from the United States Supreme Court out of New York that is greatly expected, or I should say significant. There's some very, very high hopes that's going to drastically change the legal landscape, not only in California, but throughout the nation regarding firearms and pending firearm cases and things like that. Thanks for watching. See you at the next ride.